I never believed in ghosts. 23 years in the army, 3 deployments, and I'd seen enough real horror to know that the living were far more terrifying than any story about the dead. But what happened at Camp Pendleton Sector 7 in the winter of 2019 changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible in this world. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what does matter is that I was a staff sergeant with the 3rd Battalion, stationed at the northernmost perimeter of the base. Sector 7 was what we called the Forgotten Corner, a cluster of buildings that had been abandoned since the early 1980s when budget cuts forced the consolidation of training facilities. The area consisted of 4 concrete barracks, a defunct mess hall, and an old women's Army Corps dormitory that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The temperature that December night was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with intermittent fog rolling in from the Pacific. I remember checking my watch 2,347 hours Zulu, when Specialist Rodriguez came back from his patrol route looking like he'd seen the devil himself. Rodriguez was tough as nails, a kid from East LA who'd grown up in neighborhoods where gunshots were background music. Nothing rattled him. But that night, his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't light his cigarette. I was manning the checkpoint at grid reference 33S UBV 847-392, the access point to Sector 7, when he approached my position. The kid's face was pale, and there was this look in his eyes, not fear exactly, but something deeper. Confusion mixed with genuine terror. "Sergeant, I need to report something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I could see his breath in the cold air, but what struck me was how he kept glancing back toward the abandoned buildings. I'd been Rodriguez's squad leader for 8 months. He was reliable, never complained, never caused problems. So when he started talking about hearing crying coming from Building 4, the old WAC dormitory, I didn't immediately dismiss it as bullshit. He described it as a woman's voice, sobbing softly but distinctly, coming from the 3rd floor windows. The building had been sealed since 1983, with steel plates welded over the entrances and chain-link fencing around the perimeter. What made my skin crawl wasn't just Rodriguez's description. It was the fact that PFC Martinez had reported similar sounds 3 nights earlier during his patrol. Martinez was from a different squad, different shift rotation. There was no way they could have coordinated their stories. And Martinez had been so shaken by what he heard that he'd requested a transfer to day shift immediately afterward. I grabbed my radio and contacted Sergeant First Class Thompson at the main post. Bravo 7 to base, requesting permission to conduct welfare check on Sector 7 structures. The response crackled back through static. Negative, Bravo 7. Maintain current positions. Buildings are secured and off limits. But standing there in that December fog, watching Rodriguez's hands tremble as he lit his 3rd cigarette, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first firefight in Afghanistan. That gnawing sensation in your gut that tells you something is fundamentally wrong with the world around you. The kind of feeling that makes seasoned soldiers second-guess everything they think they know. Rodriguez looked at me with those haunted eyes and said something that still gives me chills. "Sergeant, I heard her calling for help. She was calling someone's name over and over, but I couldn't make it out. And the weird thing is, it didn't sound like it was coming through the walls. It sounded like it was coming from right behind me." That was when I knew we were dealing with something that couldn't be explained by military protocols or standard operating procedures. Something that would challenge everything I thought I understood about the boundaries between the living and the dead. The reports started multiplying faster than we could process them. Within 72 hours of Rodriguez's encounter, I had 4 separate incident reports sitting on my desk, all describing the same phenomenon. Each one detailed crying sounds coming from Building 4 during the hours between 2300 and 0400. What made these reports particularly unsettling was the precision of the details. Corporal Williams, a combat engineer with 12 years of service, filed his report on December 18 at 0630 hours. He described hearing what he called sustained female weeping at approximately 0215 hours while conducting his standard perimeter check. Williams noted that the crying seemed to move from window to window on the 3rd floor, as if someone was walking from room to room. He attempted to illuminate the building with his surefire tactical light, but the beam couldn't penetrate the thick steel plates covering the windows. Private First Class Chen's account was even more detailed. Chen had been assigned to the 0000 to 0600 shift and reported that at 0247 hours, he heard what sounded like a woman calling out, "Tommy, please help me, Tommy." The name was repeated approximately 6 to 8 times before the voice dissolved back into sobbing. Chen's report included a hand-drawn diagram of his position relative to Building 4, with precise measurements and compass bearings. What bothered me most wasn't just the consistency of these reports, it was the fact that none of these soldiers knew each other personally. Williams worked motor pool maintenance, Chen was Signal Corps, Martinez was infantry, and Rodriguez was military police. Different units, different schedules, different areas of expertise. Yet they were all describing identical experiences down to the specific time frame and the emotional quality of the crying. I decided to pull the security footage from camera station Delta 7, which had a partial view of Building 4's eastern facade. The night vision cameras were equipped with audio recording capability, though the quality was often compromised by wind and electronic interference. I spent 3 hours reviewing footage from December 15th through 18th, focusing on the time frames mentioned in the reports. At 0231 hours on December 17th, I found something that made my hands go cold. The audio picked up what sounded distinctly like sobbing, lasting approximately 43 seconds. The sound was faint but unmistakably human. I enhanced the audio using the base's digital processing equipment and played it back multiple times. Each time I heard it, the crying seemed more desperate, more real. But here's what really shook me. When I checked the camera's visual feed during those same 43 seconds, there was absolutely nothing visible near Building 4. No movement, no shadows, no indication of any human presence. The audio and visual evidence were completely disconnected, as if the sound was coming from somewhere the cameras couldn't see. I took the recordings to Captain Morrison, my company commander, expecting him to order a full investigation. Instead, he looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before, not dismissive, but cautious. Almost afraid. Morrison was a straight shooter who'd served 2 tours in Iraq. Nothing fazed him. "Sergeant, how many people know about these reports?" he asked, closing the folder without reviewing the contents. "Just me and the soldiers who filed them, sir. I haven't distributed the information beyond my immediate chain of command." Morrison was quiet for a long time, staring at the folder. Finally, he said something that chilled me to the bone. "There's been talk about that building before. Way before your time here. Keep these reports contained for now. Don't file them with Battalion until I tell you otherwise." When I pressed him for more information, Morrison's response was curt. "Some things are better left alone, Sergeant. Focus your patrols on other sectors until further notice." But orders or no orders, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something that demanded investigation, not avoidance. That night, lying in my barracks, I kept thinking about Chen's report. The name, Tommy, kept echoing in my head, and I found myself wondering who Tommy was, and why a crying woman in an abandoned building would be calling for his help. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Against Captain Morrison's implicit orders, I decided to conduct my own investigation. I couldn't let sleeping dogs lie when my soldiers were filing incident reports about phenomena that defied explanation. My military training had taught me that every problem has a solution if you apply the right methodology and resources. I contacted Technical Sergeant Maria Santos from the Signal Intelligence Unit, someone I'd worked with during a previous assignment at Fort Gordon. Santos specialized in electronic surveillance and acoustic analysis. More importantly, she owed me a favor from when I'd covered for her during a particularly messy divorce proceeding that could have affected her security clearance. "I need some off-the-books technical support," I told her over coffee at the base exchange on December 20th, "something that won't show up in any official logs or requisition forms." Santos raised an eyebrow. "How off the books are we talking?" I explained the situation, showing her copies of the incident reports and the audio recording I'd extracted from the security cameras. Santos listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as I described the consistent time frames and the identical nature of the witnesses' accounts. "This is either an elaborate hoax or something genuinely anomalous," she said after reviewing the audio file on her laptop. The frequency analysis shows human vocal patterns, but there are some irregularities I can't explain. The sound seems to be emanating from multiple points simultaneously, which is acoustically impossible unless we're dealing with some kind of sophisticated projection system. 2 days later, Santos arrived at my quarters with a military-grade duffel bag containing equipment I'd never seen before. She unpacked what looked like a miniature surveillance station, 3 omnidirectional microphones, a digital spectrum analyzer, an infrared motion detector, and something she called an electromagnetic field monitor. If there's any kind of electronic manipulation happening, we'll detect it, she explained. And if there isn't, then we'll have definitive proof that something genuinely unexplainable is occurring in that building. On the night of December 22nd at 2145 hours, Santos and I positioned ourselves approximately 50 meters from Building 4's north wall. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees, and a light snow was beginning to fall. Perfect conditions for sound transmission, according to Santos. We established our monitoring station behind a concrete barrier that had been part of an old firing range. At exactly 0238 hours, the equipment began registering activity. The electromagnetic field monitor showed a sharp spike in readings, climbing from baseline 0.03 milligauss to 1.7 milligauss in less than 10 seconds. Simultaneously, the microphones picked up what was unmistakably the sound of a woman crying. But this time, we heard more than just sobbing. Through the enhanced audio system, we could make out words. "Please don't leave me here. Tommy, please come back. I'm so cold, Tommy. It's so dark in here." Santos grabbed my arm, her face pale in the green glow of the equipment displays. "The voice is coming from at least 3 different locations inside that building simultaneously," she whispered. "That's physically impossible unless there are multiple speakers involved, but the acoustic signature indicates a single source." The crying continued for nearly 2 minutes, during which time the infrared motion detector remained completely inactive. Whatever was producing these sounds wasn't generating any heat signature that our equipment could detect. Santos frantically adjusted settings and checked connections, but every instrument confirmed the same impossible data: human vocal sounds with no corresponding human presence. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. The voice seemed to change direction, as if the speaker had turned toward our position. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by what sounded like labored breathing. Through the microphones, we heard a whispered question that seemed directed at us. "Who's there? Can you help me find Tommy?" Santos looked at me with genuine terror in her eyes. "That's not possible. The voice is coming directly toward our microphones now. She knows we're here." I felt my hands trembling as I reached for my radio to contact base security, but Santos grabbed my wrist. "Wait," she said. "Look at the electromagnetic readings." The field monitor was showing readings I'd never seen before, spikes and patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat or breathing pattern. Santos stared at the display, her face a mixture of fascination and fear. "I've analyzed electronic signatures from everything from radar systems to medical equipment. I've never seen patterns like this. It's like something is trying to communicate through electromagnetic pulses." At 0241 hours, all the activity stopped. The electromagnetic readings returned to baseline, the microphones fell silent, and Building 4 stood as still and lifeless as it had appeared for decades. But Santos and I both knew we'd documented something that challenged every assumption we had about what was possible in the physical world. The next morning, Santos handed me a sealed envelope containing copies of all our recordings and data analysis. "I'm officially forgetting this ever happened," she said. "But you need to understand something. What we recorded last night can't be explained by any known technology or natural phenomenon. Whatever is in that building, it's aware of external observers, and it's trying to communicate." That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with unexplained sounds anymore. We were dealing with intelligence. The name, Tommy, wouldn't leave me alone. After Santos and I documented that impossible communication, I knew I had to dig deeper into Building 4's history. Military installations keep meticulous records, and I had access to historical archives through my administrative clearance. What I found in those dusty files would explain everything and make the situation infinitely more disturbing. I spent my off-duty hours in the base records office, a windowless concrete room in the basement of the administration building. Master Sergeant Kelly, the records custodian, was initially reluctant to let me access files dating back to the 1970s, but my explanation about conducting a facilities assessment convinced her to unlock the storage cabinets. The first document I found was dated March 15, 1978. Incident Report, Unexplained Death, Building 4, Sector 7. The victim was identified as Specialist Rebecca and Martinez, age 22, Women's Army Corps, serial number RA147896552. According to the report, Martinez was found dead in room 347 of Building 4 at 0615 hours on March 14, 1978, by her roommate, Specialist Carol Johnson. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, but as I read through the investigative files, inconsistencies began to emerge. The military police report noted that Martinez's body was found suspended from a ceiling fixture that maintenance records showed had been removed 2 weeks prior for safety repairs. The fixture shouldn't have been capable of supporting human body weight. More troubling was the coroner's preliminary report, which documented defensive wounds on Martinez's hands and arms that were inconsistent with self-inflicted harm. The report also noted that Martinez's fingernails contained skin tissue that didn't match her own DNA profile. Someone else had been in that room with her. But it was a single page buried deep in the file that made my hands start shaking. A witness statement from Specialist Johnson, Martinez's roommate, described hearing Martinez crying and calling out for someone named Tommy during the hours before her death. Johnson's statement read, "Rebecca kept saying, 'Tommy, please help me,' and 'Tommy, don't leave me here alone.' I thought she was talking to her boyfriend back home, but she told me the next morning she hadn't spoken to anyone." The boyfriend's name, according to Martinez's personnel file, was Thomas Michael Sullivan, a Marine Corps Lance Corporal stationed at Camp Lejeune. Sullivan's statement, taken by military investigators, confirmed that he hadn't had contact with Martinez for over 2 weeks prior to her death due to communication restrictions during a training exercise. I found another document that stopped me cold, a request for transfer submitted by Martinez just 3 days before her death. The reason listed was ongoing harassment by superior officers. The request was denied, and Martinez was ordered to remain at her current assignment pending a disciplinary review for insubordination and failure to maintain proper military bearing. The disciplinary review was initiated by First Sergeant James Kowalski, Building 4's senior non-commissioned officer. Kowalski's incident reports painted Martinez as a problematic soldier who violated curfew, failed to maintain her quarters, and showed disrespect toward authority figures. But when I cross-referenced these reports with Martinez's previous performance evaluations, I found a completely different picture. Her earlier supervisors consistently rated her as exemplary, with commendations for leadership potential and dedication to duty. Something had changed dramatically in the months before her death, and all the changes coincided with her assignment to Building 4 under Kowalski's supervision. I dug deeper into Kowalski's military record and found a pattern that made my stomach turn. Over a 6-year period, 4 different female soldiers under his command had filed complaints about inappropriate conduct. Each complaint was either dismissed or resulted in the transfer of the complainant to different units. Kowalski's career continued without interruption. The most damning document was a medical report I found in Martinez's file. 2 weeks before her death, she had visited the base medical facility complaining of anxiety, insomnia, and what she described as feeling unsafe in her barracks. The examining physician noted bruising on her arms that Martinez claimed resulted from training accidents, but the pattern and location of the bruises were inconsistent with standard military exercises. I realized that Rebecca Martinez hadn't committed suicide. She'd been murdered, and the investigation had been covered up to protect Kowalski and possibly others involved in systematically abusing female soldiers in Building 4. The crying that Rodriguez, Martinez, Chen, and the others had been hearing wasn't some unexplained phenomenon. It was Rebecca Martinez, still calling for help from the room where she died. But that realization led to an even more chilling question. If Rebecca was still somehow present in Building 4, still crying for Tommy to help her, what did she want from us? And why was her presence becoming stronger and more communicative after 41 years of silence? The answer to that question would require me to find out what happened to First Sergeant Kowalski after Martinez's death, and whether the system that had failed to protect her was still protecting those responsible for her murder. That night, as I lay in my barracks staring at the ceiling, I could swear I heard faint crying coming from the direction of Sector 7. And for the first time, I thought I heard something else mixed in with the sobbing, the sound of someone calling my name. Finding information about First Sergeant James Kowalski proved more difficult than I'd anticipated. His personnel file had been transferred to archives at the Human Resources Command in St. Louis, but when I submitted a formal request for records review, I received a response that made my blood run cold. Records for the individual in question have been classified under national security provisions. Access denied. A first sergeant's personnel file doesn't get classified unless something significant happened that the military wants buried forever. I realized I was dealing with a cover-up that went far beyond a single incident in 1978. I decided to take a different approach. Through unofficial channels, I contacted retired Master Sergeant Patricia Hernandez, who had served as the base's senior administrative NCO during the late 1970s. Hernandez was now living in San Diego and agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near Mission Beach on my next weekend leave. Hernandez was a small woman in her 70s, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her legendary among military administrators. When I mentioned Kowalski's name, her expression hardened immediately. "That bastard should have been court-martialed," she said without preamble. Instead, they transferred him to Germany and promoted him to sergeant major. The army protected him because exposing what he did would have implicated his chain of command. Hernandez explained that Martinez wasn't Kowalski's only victim. Between 1976 and 1978, 7 female soldiers in Building 4 had reported various forms of harassment, assault, and intimidation. The complaints followed a consistent pattern: late-night inspections that involved inappropriate physical contact, threats of disciplinary action for soldiers who resisted, and systematic isolation of victims from their support networks. Rebecca Martinez was different from the others, Hernandez said, stirring her coffee with hands that trembled slightly with age. She was smart, educated, and she kept detailed records of everything that happened to her. She had evidence that could have destroyed Kowalski and several officers who knew what was happening but chose to look the other way. According to Hernandez, Martinez had been preparing to file formal charges through the Inspector General's office when she died. Her evidence included photographs, witness statements, and audio recordings she'd made using a small tape recorder her boyfriend Tommy had sent her from North Carolina. The night she died, Martinez called me at home around 2,200 hours, Hernandez said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. She said she was scared, that Kowalski had threatened her directly that afternoon. She said she was going to hide her evidence somewhere safe and mail copies to her boyfriend the next morning. She never got the chance. Hernandez revealed that immediately after Martinez's death, Building 4 was sealed and searched by a team from Criminal Investigation Division. The search lasted 3 days, but no evidence supporting Martinez's allegations was ever found. Her personal effects, including any documentation she might have compiled, disappeared completely. I tried to follow up with her boyfriend, this Tommy kid, but the Marine Corps stonewalled me completely, Hernandez said. They claimed he was deployed on classified operations and couldn't be contacted. By the time I located him 6 months later, he'd been discharged under mysterious circumstances. The most disturbing revelation came when Hernandez described what happened in the weeks following Martinez's death. 3 other female soldiers who had been potential witnesses to Kowalski's behavior received sudden orders for immediate transfer to different bases. One of them, Specialist Diana Walsh, refused the transfer and was subsequently charged with insubordination and given a general discharge under other than honorable conditions. The fix was in from the beginning, Hernandez said bitterly. Martinez's death was ruled suicide within 48 hours, before the investigation was even completed. The base commander at the time, Colonel Harrison, personally oversaw the case closure. 2 years later, Harrison retired as a brigadier general, But Hernandez saved the most chilling information for last. She leaned across the table, her voice barely audible above the cafe's background noise. About 6 months after Martinez died, soldiers started reporting strange things in Building 4. Crying sounds, voices calling for help, equipment malfunctioning without explanation. The reports were so consistent that the base commander ordered the building sealed permanently in 1982. According to Hernandez, the official explanation for closing Building 4 was structural concerns and asbestos contamination. But the real reason was that personnel refused to enter the building after dark. Even maintenance crews reported feeling watched and hearing unexplained sounds during daytime repairs. The brass thought sealing the building would end the problem, Hernandez said. But you can't bury the truth forever. Eventually, it finds a way to surface. As I drove back to base that evening, I realized that Rebecca Martinez hadn't been randomly calling out for Tommy during her final hours. She'd been trying to reach the one person who might have been able to help her, the one person who had evidence of what was happening to her. And now, 41 years later, she was still trying to complete that desperate communication. But there was something else that troubled me deeply. If Martinez had hidden evidence somewhere in Building 4 before her death, and if that evidence had never been found despite extensive searches, then it might still be there. And if Rebecca's spirit was becoming increasingly active and communicative, maybe she was trying to show us where that evidence was hidden. The question was whether I was prepared to enter Building 4 and find out what Rebecca Martinez had died trying to protect. The decision to enter Building 4 wasn't one I made lightly. I spent 3 sleepless nights weighing the risks against the potential for finally giving Rebecca Martinez the justice she'd been denied for over 4 decades. On December 28th, I made contact with Sergeant First Class David Kim from the Base Engineering Unit, someone I trusted and who had the technical skills necessary for what I was planning. Kim had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer and specialized in structural assessment and demolition. More importantly, he had access to the tools needed to remove the steel plates that had sealed Building 4 since 1982. When I explained the situation, his initial response was predictable skepticism. "You're talking about breaking into a condemned building based on ghost stories," he said during our meeting at the base motor pool. "That's a court-martial offense at minimum, probably federal charges for destruction of government property." But when I showed him copies of Martinez's personnel file and the inconsistencies in the official investigation, Kim's attitude changed. As someone who had lost friends to cover-ups and bureaucratic incompetence in combat zones, he understood the importance of exposing systemic failures that cost lives. "If we're going to do this, we do it right," Kim said finally. "Full documentation, proper safety protocols, and we get in and out without leaving evidence of forced entry." Kim spent 2 days conducting reconnaissance of Building 4, using his official duties as cover for examining the structural modifications made during the 1982 closure. He discovered that the steel plates covering the main entrance were secured with standard military padlocks rather than welded permanently, suggesting that someone had maintained access to the building over the years. On the night of December 30th, at 0230 hours, Kim and I approached Building 4 equipped with bolt cutters, tactical flashlights, and a digital camera for documenting whatever we found inside. The temperature was 23 degrees with clear skies and no moon, providing optimal concealment from base security patrols. Kim made quick work of the padlocks securing the steel plate over the main entrance. "These locks are standard issue, probably changed regularly," he whispered as we prepared to enter. "Someone's been coming in here on a routine basis." The interior of Building 4 was a time capsule from 1978. Dust covered everything, but the basic structure remained intact. Military-issue furniture sat exactly where it had been abandoned, and faded notices were still posted on bulletin boards in the common areas. The air smelled of mildew and something else, a sweet, cloying odor that reminded me of flowers left too long in water. We climbed the stairwell to the 3rd floor, our flashlight beams cutting through darkness that seemed thicker and more oppressive than natural shadow. Room 347, where Martinez had died, was located at the end of a corridor lined with identical doors. Each room had a small placard indicating its original occupant, but the nameplate for Room 347 had been removed, leaving only mounting holes in the painted wood. Kim examined the door with his flashlight and found something that made him grab my arm. "Look at this," he said, directing his beam toward the doorframe. "Fresh scratches in the paint, probably made within the last few months. Someone's been using this room recently." The door to room 347 was unlocked, which surprised both of us given the security surrounding the building's closure. Inside, we found a small space containing 2 military-issue beds, 2 wall lockers, and a single window overlooking the eastern perimeter of the base. One of the beds had been stripped completely, while the others still contained linens that had rotted to fragments over 4 decades. But it was what Kim found behind the intact wall locker that changed everything. Using a pry bar to move the heavy metal cabinet, he exposed a section of baseboard that had been carefully removed and replaced. Behind the baseboard, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and canvas, was a manila envelope containing documents that Rebecca Martinez had hidden 41 years earlier. The envelope contained 8 photographs showing bruises and injuries on Martinez's body, 3 pages of handwritten notes detailing specific incidents of harassment and assault, and a small tape recorder with 2 cassette tapes. The photographs were dated and signed by Martinez, creating a chronological record of escalating abuse between September and March 1978. But the most damning evidence was contained on the cassette tapes. Using Kim's portable radio, we listened to conversations Martinez had secretly recorded during late-night inspections conducted by Kowalski and 2 other NCOs whose voices I didn't recognize. The recordings captured explicit threats, descriptions of physical violence, and discussions about ways to silence Martinez if she continued to document their behavior. One conversation, recorded just 3 days before Martinez's death, contained Kowalski's voice saying, "The little bitch thinks she can threaten us with her evidence. We need to make sure she understands what happens to soldiers who don't follow orders." As we sat in that cold, abandoned room listening to the voices of dead men threatening a woman they would eventually murder, I felt a presence that wasn't entirely psychological. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and our flashlight beams began flickering despite fresh batteries. Kim looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "Do you feel that?" The sensation was difficult to describe, like being watched by someone standing just outside the range of our vision. The air seemed to vibrate with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. And then, barely audible above the sound of our own breathing, we heard it. A woman's voice, clear and distinct, saying, "Thank you." Kim grabbed the envelope containing Martinez's evidence and looked around the room with genuine fear in his eyes. "We need to leave. Now." But as we prepared to exit room 347, something happened that convinced me we weren't alone in that building. The door, which we had left open, slowly closed by itself with a soft click. When Kim tried to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. We were locked inside the room where Rebecca Martinez had died, with evidence that could finally expose her killers. And from somewhere in the darkness beyond the door, we could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. The footsteps in the corridor weren't ghostly or ethereal, they were heavy, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Kim and I looked at each other with the shared realization that we weren't dealing with paranormal activity anymore. Someone else was in Building 4, and they knew we were there. Kim tried the door handle again, applying more force, but it remained locked from the outside. The footsteps stopped directly outside room 347, and we could see the shadow of feet blocking the light beneath the door. Whoever was out there stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, while Kim and I held our breath and gripped our flashlights like weapons. Then a voice spoke through the door, an older man's voice with the unmistakable cadence of a senior military officer. "I know you're in there, Sergeant. You found something that doesn't belong to you." My heart was pounding so hard I was certain it could be heard through the door. Kim had positioned himself near the window, preparing to break the glass if necessary, while I clutched the envelope containing Martinez's evidence against my chest. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Identify yourself." There was a long pause before the voice responded, someone who spent 40 years making sure certain secrets stayed buried. "You're about to undo a lot of careful work." The man outside the door seemed to know exactly what we'd found and why we were there. This wasn't a chance encounter with base security or a routine patrol that had stumbled across our break-in. This was someone who had been monitoring our investigation from the beginning. Rebecca Martinez deserves justice, I said through the door. What she documented happened to her, and people need to know the truth. The response chilled me to the bone. Rebecca Martinez was an unstable soldier who couldn't handle military life. Her death was a tragedy, but it was also inevitable. Some people aren't strong enough for military service. Kim had managed to partially open the window, but the steel security grating installed during the building's closure made escape impossible. We were trapped with evidence that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden, just as they had killed Martinez 41 years earlier. The investigation was thorough and proper, the voice continued. First Sergeant Kowalski was a decorated NCO who served his country with honor. The allegations against him were fabricated by a disturbed individual who took her own life rather than face the consequences of her false accusations. I realized I was listening to someone who had been part of the original cover-up, possibly one of the officers who had protected Kowalski and suppressed Martinez's evidence. The careful way he spoke suggested legal training or extensive experience with military justice proceedings. "We know about the other victims," I said, hoping to provoke some kind of admission. Martinez wasn't the only woman Kowalski attacked. There's a pattern of abuse that was systematically covered up. "There were no other victims," the voice replied with cold certainty. "There were disciplinary problems with certain female soldiers who couldn't adapt to military standards. Those individuals were appropriately counseled or transferred to more suitable assignments. Kim had found a small pry bar in his toolkit and was working on the window grating, but the metal was too thick and the mounting points too secure. The man outside our door seemed content to wait while we exhausted our escape options. But then something happened that changed the entire dynamic of our situation. The temperature in room 347 dropped dramatically, not gradually, but instantly, like stepping into a freezer. Our flashlight beams began to flicker and dim despite fresh batteries, and the air itself seemed to thicken with a presence that was unmistakably hostile. The man outside the door noticed the change too. His confident tone was replaced by something that sounded like fear. "What the hell is happening in there?" Kim grabbed my arm and pointed toward the corner of the room where the two walls met. In the flickering light of our failing flashlights, a figure was taking shape, translucent at first, then gradually becoming more solid and defined. It was a young woman in military fatigues, with short dark hair and eyes that burned with an anger that had been building for 41 years. Rebecca Martinez wasn't just present in room 347, she was manifesting with an intensity that neither Kim nor I had ever experienced. And she wasn't looking at us with the desperate pleading we'd heard in her recorded voice. She was looking toward the door with pure hatred. "Open it," she said, her voice clear and strong for the first time since we'd begun investigating her death. "Open the door." The man outside began backing away from room 347, his footsteps retreating down the corridor. But the door handle was turning by itself, and I realized that Rebecca Martinez had finally found a way to confront the people who had destroyed her life and buried her truth. When the door swung open, Kim and I saw a figure at the end of the corridor, an elderly man in civilian clothes who looked like he might have been military once upon a time. But Rebecca Martinez was moving toward him with purpose, and for the first time since her death, she had the power to demand answers. The hunt for justice was no longer just ours. The elderly man at the end of the corridor wasn't running, but his controlled retreat down the hallway told me he knew exactly who Rebecca Martinez was and why she was there. As Kim and I emerged from room 347, clutching the envelope of evidence, I got my first clear look at the person who had been monitoring our investigation. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and the ramrod-straight posture that never leaves career military officers. Even in civilian clothes, everything about him screamed command authority. But his eyes held something I'd rarely seen in senior officers: genuine fear. "Colonel Harrison," Rebecca's voice carried down the corridor with an otherworldly clarity. "You remember me now, don't you?" The name hit me like a physical blow. Master Sergeant Hernandez had mentioned Colonel Harrison as the base commander who personally oversaw the closure of Martinez's case. According to her, he'd retired as a brigadier general 2 years after Martinez's death. Now, 41 years later, he was standing in the building where he'd helped cover up a murder. Harrison stopped his retreat and turned to face us, his military bearing reasserting itself despite the impossible situation. Specialist Martinez was mentally unstable, he said, addressing Rebecca's manifestation as if she were a subordinate soldier reporting for duty. Her death was thoroughly investigated by qualified personnel. Rebecca's form became more solid, more present, as her anger intensified. You knew what Kowalski was doing. I sent you a letter requesting transfer 3 weeks before he killed me. You never responded. Transfer requests require justification, Harrison replied with the same cold bureaucracy that had failed Martinez when she was alive. Your performance evaluations didn't support reassignment to a different unit. Kim was recording everything with his smartphone, documenting what might be the first conversation between a murder victim and her killer's accomplice in military history. But I was focused on something else, Harrison had said. He'd referred to Martinez in the present tense, as if she were still an active duty soldier under his command. You're still wearing your uniform, Rebecca said, and I realized she was right. Despite his civilian clothes, Harrison carried himself as if he were still responsible for the soldiers under his command. You never retired from this case, did you? You've been coming back here, making sure the evidence stayed hidden. Harrison's composure cracked slightly. The Army's reputation had to be protected. One unstable soldier's false allegations could have damaged the careers of good men who served their country honorably. Good men, Rebecca repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. Kowalski raped me 6 times between September and February. Staff Sergeant Morrison held me down while Kowalski photographed the assault for blackmail. Lieutenant Weber threatened to have me court-martialed if I reported what was happening. The names meant nothing to Kim and me, but they clearly meant something to Harrison. His face went white as Rebecca recited details that had never appeared in any official report. Those are serious allegations, Harrison said, falling back on military procedure. If you had evidence to support those claims, you should have followed proper channels. I did follow proper channels. Rebecca's voice rose to a shout that echoed through the abandoned building. I reported to my squad leader, my platoon sergeant, and finally to you directly. Every time I was told to stop making trouble or face disciplinary action. Harrison looked directly at the envelope in my hands. Whatever you think you've found in there is fabricated evidence. Martinez was planning to frame innocent soldiers because she couldn't handle the stress of military service. But I had listened to the tape recordings. I had seen the photographs. Rebecca Martinez hadn't fabricated anything. She had documented systematic abuse with the thoroughness of a trained investigator. Tell them about the others, Rebecca demanded, moving closer to Harrison. Tell them about Specialist Walsh, Corporal Thompson, Private Rodriguez. Tell them how many women you silenced to protect your precious reputation. Harrison's military mask finally slipped completely. You don't understand the bigger picture, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. The women's integration program was under congressional review. One scandal could have set back female military participation by decades. Sometimes individual tragedies have to be weighed against larger strategic objectives. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Harrison had sacrificed Rebecca Martinez and an unknown number of other female soldiers to protect a policy program he considered more important than their lives. Kim grabbed my arm and pointed toward the stairwell. We need to get this evidence to authorities now, before someone else shows up. But Rebecca Martinez wasn't finished. Where are they buried? She asked Harrison. Walsh, Thompson, Rodriguez. They didn't just disappear. You killed them too, didn't you? Harrison's response was barely a whisper. Some secrets are too dangerous to let live. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with one covered-up murder. We were looking at a systematic elimination of witnesses that had continued for decades. And Harrison's presence in Building 4 meant the killing might not be over. Rebecca Martinez had been trying to warn us about more than her own death. She'd been trying to expose a conspiracy that was still active, still protecting itself, still willing to kill to maintain its secrets. The question was whether Kim and I would live long enough to get her evidence to people who could act on it. Harrison reached into his jacket, and I saw the outline of a pistol beneath his civilian clothes. The realization hit me that we were facing someone who had spent 40 years eliminating witnesses to protect a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command. Harrison wasn't just covering up Martinez's murder, he was prepared to add Kim and me to his list of necessary casualties. "You're both excellent soldiers," Harrison said, his voice regaining its command authority. "Your service records show dedication and loyalty to the Army. It would be tragic if you were found dead in this condemned building, victims of a structural collapse during an unauthorized exploration." Kim was backing toward the stairwell, but Harrison had positioned himself to block our only exit route. The envelope containing Martinez's evidence felt like it weighed 100 pounds in my hands. 41 years of waiting for justice, and it might die with us in the same building where Rebecca had been murdered. "The evidence is already copied and distributed," I lied, hoping to buy time. "Technical Sergeant Santos has recordings of everything we found. Killing us won't stop the truth from coming out." Harrison's expression didn't change. "Sergeant Santos died in a vehicle accident 2 days ago. Her computer files were corrupted by an electrical surge the same evening. There are no copies of anything you think you discovered." My blood went cold. Santos had been helping me investigate the paranormal activity, but she'd also been the only person who knew about our electronic surveillance of Building 4. If Harrison was telling the truth, then Kim and I were the only people left who knew about Martinez's hidden evidence. "You killed her," Kim said, his voice shaking with rage. "How many people have you murdered to keep this quiet?" "I've protected the United States Army from scandal and disgrace," Harrison replied. "Every action I've taken has been in service to something larger than individual lives. Martinez, Walsh, Thompson, Rodriguez, they were acceptable losses to preserve institutional integrity. But Rebecca Martinez had been listening to every word, and her manifestation was becoming more powerful with each admission Harrison made. The temperature in the corridor had dropped to the point where our breath was visible, and the building's electrical systems were responding to her presence in ways that defied explanation. The overhead lights, which had been disconnected since 1982, suddenly flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that made Harrison's face look skeletal. The building's public address system activated with a squeal of feedback, and Rebecca's voice echoed through every speaker in the facility. "Tell them where you buried us," her amplified voice demanded. "Tell them about the unmarked graves at grid reference 33S UBV901447. Harrison spun around as if Rebecca were standing directly behind him, his pistol now drawn and pointed at shadows that seemed to be moving independently of any light source. "You're dead," he shouted at her manifestation. "You've been dead for 40 years. You have no power here." "I have the power of truth," Rebecca replied, and every window in Building 4 shattered simultaneously, showering the corridor with glass. "And I have the power of justice denied." The building's fire alarm system activated, sending electronic signals that would automatically alert base security to structural emergency in Sector 7. Within minutes, fire trucks and military police would be converging on our location. Harrison's carefully planned elimination of witnesses was falling apart. But desperate men make deadly decisions. Harrison turned his pistol toward Kim and me, his finger moving toward the trigger. "You should have left the past alone," he said. "Some secrets are worth dying for." That's when Rebecca Martinez demonstrated that the dead have powers the living can't understand. Every piece of metal in the corridor, door handles, light fixtures, ventilation grates, began vibrating with increasing intensity. Harrison's pistol was torn from his grip by an invisible force and flung down the stairwell. Kim grabbed my arm and we ran toward the far end of the corridor, where emergency exit signs were now blazing with supernatural brightness. Behind us, we could hear Harrison screaming as Rebecca's manifestations surrounded him with the accumulated rage of 4 decades. "Where are the others buried?" her voice echoed through the building. "Where did you put Walsh? Where did you put Thompson?" We reached the emergency exit and Kim kicked open the door, triggering additional alarms that would bring even more attention to Building 4. As we stumbled down the external fire escape, I could see base security vehicles already responding to the electronic alerts, their red and blue lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. But from inside Building 4, we could hear Harrison's voice, no longer commanding but pleading, "Please, I was following orders." The decision came from Pentagon level. I was protecting the integration program. Rebecca's response carried across the base with supernatural clarity, "You were protecting yourselves. And now you're going to face the consequences you should have faced 41 years ago." When base security reached Building 4, they found Harrison unconscious in the corridor, clutching his chest and mumbling about women who wouldn't stay dead. Kim and I were detained immediately, but we had Martinez's evidence and Kim's recordings of Harrison's admissions. More importantly, Rebecca Martinez had finally gotten her chance to confront the man who had buried her murder. And she had made sure that this time, the truth couldn't be contained. The military justice system moves slowly, but when it moves, it's thorough. Within 72 hours of our arrest, investigators from the Army Criminal Investigation Command had taken possession of Rebecca Martinez's evidence and begun cross-referencing her documentation with archived personnel files from the late 1970s. Harrison was found to have suffered a massive heart attack during his encounter with Rebecca in Building 4. He survived, but the medical trauma left him unable to maintain the careful denials he'd practiced for 4 decades. Under questioning, he provided investigators with detailed information about the cover-up, including the locations of 3 unmarked graves at the coordinates Rebecca had specified. The remains of specialists Diana Walsh and Jennifer Thompson, along with Private Maria Rodriguez, were recovered from a remote section of the base that had been designated as a training area since 1979. Each woman had been reported as AWOL and subsequently discharged in absentia. Their families had been told they were missing persons cases beyond military jurisdiction. Kim and I faced court-martial proceedings for breaking and entering, destruction of government property, and violation of direct orders. But the evidence we'd recovered from room 347 changed everything. Martinez's tape recordings, photographs, and written documentation provided irrefutable proof of systematic abuse and murder that had been covered up at the highest levels of command. The investigation expanded beyond Harrison to include 2 retired generals who had been base commanders during the relevant period and 7 former NCOs who had participated in the conspiracy. 3 of them were dead, but the 4 survivors faced federal charges for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder. But justice in the military isn't the same as justice in civilian courts. The Army's primary concern was controlling the narrative and minimizing damage to institutional reputation. Media coverage was limited to brief mentions of historical personnel matters under review. The families of the murdered women received substantial financial settlements in exchange for signing comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Harrison died of a second heart attack 6 months after his arrest, before his court-martial could be completed. The official cause of death was listed as complications from cardiovascular disease, but the guards reported that he spent his final weeks claiming Rebecca Martinez was standing in his cell, asking him the same question over and over, "Where's Tommy?" Kim was transferred to a base in Germany after receiving a general discharge under other than honorable conditions. His engineering skills made him valuable enough to avoid prison time, but his military career was effectively over. He sends me emails occasionally, and he still swears he can hear crying sounds when he walks past abandoned buildings. My own court-martial resulted in a reduction in rank and 6 months of detention, followed by administrative discharge. The Army made it clear that my continued presence was incompatible with good order and discipline. Officially, I was being punished for breaking regulations. Unofficially, I was being eliminated as a witness to institutional failure. But Rebecca Martinez got something she'd been waiting 41 years to achieve. On March 14, 2020, exactly 42 years after her death, the Army issued a posthumous correction to her personnel record. Her cause of death was changed from suicide to homicide, and she received a posthumous promotion to sergeant along with a Bronze Star Medal for courage in documenting crimes against fellow soldiers. Thomas Sullivan, her boyfriend Tommy, was located in North Carolina where he'd been living as a disabled veteran since his discharge from the Marine Corps in 1979. He attended a small ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery where Martinez was reinterred with full military honors. Sullivan, now in his 60s, told me afterward that he'd been having dreams about Rebecca calling for help, and the dreams had stopped the night Harrison died. Building 4 was demolished in 2021 as part of a base modernization project. The official reason given was structural instability, but soldiers from the demolition crew reported that their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly when working near room 347. The final explosive charges had to be detonated manually because the electronic firing systems wouldn't function properly. I work private security now, and I tell people I left the army for personal reasons. But sometimes, usually around 0230 hours, I wake up thinking I hear a woman's voice calling out, "Thank you." It might be my imagination, or it might be Rebecca Martinez letting me know that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. The white lady of Building 4 isn't crying anymore. But late at night, when the California fog rolls in from the Pacific, soldiers at Camp Pendleton still report hearing something in Sector 7. Not crying this time, but something that sounds like laughter, the laughter of someone who finally got to tell her story and finally got someone to listen. Some ghosts aren't looking for peace. They're looking for justice. And Rebecca Martinez proved that sometimes, if you wait long enough and fight hard enough, even the dead can win.